no one gets off the hook. As Portia puts it, if God's justice were to prevail, none would be saved. For Anselm, God can't just dismiss the case against humanity, for that would thwart the order of justice in the world that God has created. So to make a long story short, just as Portia saves Antonio from death by brilliant legal strategy, God saves humanity by a theological strategy at once fully human and fully divine. A strategy that respects the created order of justice and yet is also an act of mercy and grace. God sends his divine Son into the world willingly to take on human flesh and of just punishment for sin and save humanity from sin and restore the just relationship with God. Now, Anselm's answer to the question, cur Deus homo, why does God become human, according to Christian belief? In technical terms, Anselm's atonement theology is not without its difficulties, even for Christians. I suspect it has greater difficulty for Muslims. But if you're looking for a Christian perspective on doing business in a global economy, where debts are incurred and people are either let off the hook or made to pay, I don't think we can sidestep the profound question that Anselm is posing about the relationship between justice and mercy. Not only human, but also divine. It is, at the very least, I think, a worthy topic for Christians and Muslims to discuss. To sum up thus far, when it comes to Christian perspectives on our topic, there are several levels of analysis to consider. Different Christians might stress one level more than another. And at each level, for example, what is the nature and role of conscience, Christians might disagree. And believe me, they do. This potential for diverse views becomes more apparent when we consider the one other short passage from the Merchant of Venice. Bassanio has cause to complain, so the world is still deceived with ornament. In law, what plea so tainted and corrupt, but being seasoned with a gracious voice, obscures the shows of evil? In religion, what damned error, but some sober brow will bless it and approve it with a text? So here we have exposed further reasons for diverse views on doing business in a global community. Different interpretations of law and different interpretations of sacred texts. Here, the view of law and lawyers is quite cynical. A good lawyer can make a bad law look just. And there may be reason for such cynicism in terms of our topic. In the film Inside Job, about the global financial meltdown, one bank regulator, as I recall, I'm doing this from memory, complains that we would drive up to a bank headquarters and find 17 SUVs parked outside, and then go inside and find 17 lawyers lined up to stonewall us or convince us that the bank was doing nothing wrong. Now, diverse views on law, for example, interpretation of law and the proper use of law, is law meant to constrain or is it meant to educate? And diverse views of lawyers are huge topics that again can't be taken up here. I simply want to stress that these are crucial topics and that again, different Christians will likely have different views on these matters. And I do not think I need to stress that the fact of law and its interpretation is no small issue for Muslims as well. If Bassanio's words seem to give cause for the action proposed by a character in another of Shakespeare's plays, the first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers, it would seem, according to Bassanio, that it might be a good idea to kill all the theologians too. They can cite, and indeed have cited, texts from Scripture to justify the most questionable or heinous of acts: conquest, slavery, the Crusades. But even if theologians aren't always devious rationalizers, questions of interpretation matter. Let me give but one historical example. Martin Luther had a problem. He preached Christian freedom from the law, but the peasants of his time, this was in Germany, The peasants of his time took this too far and rose up in revolt to free themselves from economic oppression at the hands of the 1% of the day. One of their complaints was that the lands and streams that once were open to them for a common use have now been closed off to be used by the nobility alone. But in a short tract with the harrowing title, Against the Robbing and Murdering Hordes of Peasants, a tract in which Luther argues that the peasants are grossly out of line and the lords are duty-bound violently to repress their rebellion and thus avert social chaos, Luther says that, quote, it does not help the peasants when they pretend that according to Genesis 1 and 2, the first books of chapters of the Bible, that all things were created free and common, and that all of us alike have been baptized. For under the New Testament, Moses does not count. For there stands our Master Christ and subjects us along with our bodies and our property to the emperor and the law of this world when he says, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. In other words, according to the feudal system of the time, the peasants are to obey their masters to whom they have sworn an oath of fealty. If the lords of the manor are ruling unjustly, don't worry, they will have to answer to God. That's not the peasant's concern. The peasant's concern is to obey. Now, I cite this example not to put Luther in the worst possible light, but because it illustrates at least 2 points. First, the substantive matter. It remains critical to the question of doing business in a global society to ask the sort of questions the Schwabian peasants pressed. We've seen this, for instance, with liberation theology in Latin America. I think of El Salvador, where basically 12 families owned a great deal of the land. Especially in our age of environmental concern, just who does own or possess or use or profit from the earth and the skies and the seas? Or who should profit from rare earth metals, the topic of a recent case brought to the World Trade Organization by the US and other countries against China? What, if anything, does the Bible say about these things? What does the longer Christian tradition, for instance, Catholic social teaching or the World Council of Churches, say about property? Second, an interpretive matter. Luther is saying that a later text abrogates, renders no longer binding an earlier text. And I stress this in part because, if I am not mistaken, the question of abrogation of a later Quranic text, or hadith, taking precedence over an earlier one, is a question of no little import in Islam. So, there are many reasons for a plurality of Christian perspectives on doing business in a global society. So, to ensure that you will be totally confused, or at least confused on a higher plane, let me discuss one more and then I'll conclude. In the 1950s, the Protestant theologian H. Richard Niebuhr wrote a book entitled Christ and Culture. In this now classic text,